All right, class, this presentation is going to work through really the first part of lesson 5. We're going to talk about the global expansion of missions. We're going to try to look at both Adoniram and Ann Judson and Hudson and Maria Taylor. And I know we've already looked a little bit at just the explosion of gospel ministry, of international missions. But as we look at the modern era of the church, to me, this is one of the things that stands out the most. It's not modernism itself. It's not the skeptical view of Christianity and the movement towards intellectualism or empiricism, rationalism, all the isms. There's one more ism that is so important, and it's evangelism. And as we look at this era of the church, that's probably my number one goal for you, is to see just how passionate people became about evangelizing, about sharing the gospel with the world. And in light of everything we've looked at in church history since August, I love this section because it just reminds us and it shows us really kind of what it looks like to read the Great Commission and to say, okay, and to go do it, to take Acts 1:8 and say, okay, I'll take the gospel to the ends of the earth. And what we see in the lives of these four individuals, I think is amazing. So I just want to start with Adoniram and Ann Judson. Adoniram, raised in a Christian home, went off to attend Brown University, but left college pretty much an atheist, a convinced skeptic of Christianity. He fell into the wrong crowd, and they began to really kind of preach the kind of stuff that Kant was preaching, and the skepticism and this extreme rational thought. And so he left unconvinced. He came home and had to tell his family that I'm not a believer anymore. And one of his friends, there's a story that's not on the slides, but one of his friends that he had become close to, that was also a skeptic. They separated a little bit after college, and at one point, Judson was traveling, and he was in a small hotel, and the man next to him was clearly in pain and dying, and Judson could hear this, but he never saw him. But he could hear the cries through the wall, and upon leaving the next morning, he asked about it and told him the man had passed and that he was fighting for his life for health reasons. And the Judson asked his name, and the man's name, it was his friend. It was his friend, and that was really something that sparked a kind of not a revival, but really a conversion in his heart, because he came face to face with not just death, but eternity. And he realized that his skepticism and the skepticism of his friend, if it were true and the gospel were true, then his friend was in an eternal hell. And that just overwhelmed him. And so at this point, this is about the time he is attending Andover Seminary. He went to seminary as a non-believer, but thankfully, not long after beginning classes there, God saved him. And so he was saved at Andover. And God just began to quickly work in his life and prepare him for a calling that he would soon reveal to him. February 1812, there was a 2-week period that was kind of a big week, big 2 weeks for him. Within 2 weeks, he married. He was ordained to the gospel ministry and commissioned as a foreign missionary. Let me tell you, that is a busy couple of months. But not long thereafter, they both set sail for India, where they planned to devote the rest of their lives. But it was interesting. God, sometimes we have many plans. But the Old Testament teaches us that many are the plans of a man's heart, but it's God's purpose that prevails. And that is exactly what we see here. When they're on the boat traveling to India, they're with a group of other missionaries who are Baptists. And the Baptists, of course, believe in believers' baptism. But as Congregationalists, Adoniram and Ann Judson were convinced of infant baptism. And so they knew that William Carey, a man that we've already looked at, was in India, a Baptist. And so Adoniram began to study while en route, and really to try to maybe convince William Carey of his position, that the issue of, or the position, if you will, of believers' baptism was incorrect. But the opposite happened. As Adoniram studied and talked to some of the other Baptists on board, he too became convinced regarding believers' baptism, as did Anne. And so their change of view on baptism created an ethical dilemma. The missionary board that sponsored them was not Baptist. And so the Judsons, I think in a move of integrity, upon reaching India, promptly resigned, along with another shipmate of theirs, Luther Rice, who had also converted to becoming a Baptist. I'm not saying converted to Christianity, but did change denominations. And so they decided that the best thing for them to do was for Rice to return to America to raise support, which he did. And his work eventually sparked the formation of the First Baptist Foreign Missionary Society in America. And God would use all of this to lead them to the country and the people that would forever change their lives. The Judsons began their ministry in Burma in 1813. As we look at the ministry as a whole, it's Bible translation that was a key aspect of their work. By the end of Adoniram's life in 1850, he was able to translate the Bible into the Burmese language, edited several dictionaries, and authored other resources as well. This would prove to be really a long-term impact of his ministry for years and years to come. In fact, they really set the stage for all future, I believe, Christian ministry in Burma, which is now known as Myanmar. This is in Southeast Asia. But the Judsons often struggled, as you can imagine, in the 19th century Burmese climate. They often struggled with sickness. There was suffering. There was death. They lost 3 children. Anne, who was also affectionately known as Nancy, she became gravely ill at one point and had to return to America for up to 2 years to heal. So they were separated for these 2 years, and their only communication could be letters between the two of them. While at home, she discovered that she and her husband were actually somewhat of celebrities, that their passion, their sacrifice, their work had made them well known throughout the Americas. She actually used this as a means of spreading the word about their work, their translation work, their difficulties, and also some fundraising. After returning to Burma in 1824, a war promptly broke out between Burma and England, and nearly all Western men were presumed to be spies and imprisoned, and that did include Adoniram. She spent this time while he was in prison raising their young daughter, caring for 2 other Burmese orphans that had taken up with them, and also going to the prison daily to try to provide food and to plead for her husband's release. Well, he was eventually released. I can only imagine what prison life would have been like for him during this time. But they really released him to serve as a translator. But thankfully, the war ended soon after his release. But then more troubles would come. Anne would die in 1826, followed by their 2-year-old daughter just 6 months later. It's not hard to imagine a grieving Judson. He disappeared into the jungle, a tiger-infested jungle, for 40 days. He emerged, but it would take time for him to overcome the depression of all that had happened. But from 1830 to 1850, Adoniram worked tirelessly to reach Burma for Christ. He would marry 2 more times and make only 1 trip to America. So he spent the brunt of his adult life in Burma trying to reach the people for Christ. I want to share with you just one quote, and this was something that Judson wrote to Anne's father to request her hand. I think this just kind of sums up their attitude. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world, whether you can consent to her departure for a heathen land and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of a missionary life, whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Well said. The father did consent. They left the decision to Anne, and not long thereafter, they ridded themselves of all their earthly possessions, or the majority of them, and set sail for India. Let's look at Hudson Taylor and Maria Taylor. They're a little bit later than the Judsons, but not by much. And listen to a couple of paragraphs written by a Chinese Buddhist who was speaking to Hudson Taylor. Why did you not come sooner? The man's question burned in Hudson Taylor's soul as he thought of the millions of Chinese who had never heard of Christ. The middle-aged man was one of the leading officers of a sect of Reformed Buddhists in China. He had long sought truth by studying Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, but not until he heard the gospel of Jesus did he find rest for his soul. He eagerly testified to the Buddhists of the peace he had, and he began preaching Christ to his fellow countrymen. Shortly after his conversion, he had asked Taylor how long the gospel had been known in England. When he was told it had been known for hundreds of years, the man was shocked. What? For hundreds of years you have had these glad tidings, and only now have come to preach it to us? My father sought after the truth for more than 20 years and died without finding it. Oh, why did you not come sooner? You can hear this man's plea for his own father, who, according to the gospel, would be in hell. That's terrifying. And let those words from this Chinese Buddhist sink in. There are people around the world now dying without hearing the gospel, and it's our job to take it to them. Born in England, converted as a youth, and soon committed himself to the Lord's work, he quickly sensed a call to China. And I love this. He began studying medicine, and he began to train himself to live on as little means as possible. He already had an idea of what missionary life was going to be like. At just 21, he set sail for China. With financial means being scarce, he had to learn to rely upon God's provision. At the time, there were political restrictions against foreigners traveling to inland China, but he used the canals and worked around some of these provisions to spread the gospel among the Chinese. Listen to Hudson. At home, you can never know what it is to be absolutely alone. Amidst thousands, everyone looking on you with curiosity, with contempt, with suspicion, or with dislike. Thus, to learn what it is to be despised and rejected of men, and then to have the love of Jesus applied to your heart by the Holy Spirit, this is precious. This is worth coming for. I wonder how many of us would have that perspective of suspicion, contempt, curiosity, and loneliness, all for the sake of Christ. Hudson Taylor did. He married Maria in 1858, who was an English orphan ministering in a school for Chinese girls. By 1860, the travel and evangelism restriction had been lifted. It was illegal to convert to Christianity prior to that time. But Hudson's poor health led them to temporarily relocate back to England. But this was fruitful because while he was there, he completed his medical training, revised the Chinese New Testament, and organized the China Inland Mission. Just, a kind of a weekend's worth of work, right? But they returned to China in 1866 with 22 additional missionaries, but it would grow from there. But it would grow through the seeds of hardship. Their daughter died from medical complications. They were almost killed in a riot. Maria died giving birth. Hudson's second wife died of cancer, and other sicknesses were common. So the seeds of persecution, when Jesus talks about us coming to the end through endurance, the Taylors epitomized that. I mean, they lived it. However, by 1895, 10 years prior to his death, the mission had now 641 missionaries, plus 462 Chinese helpers at over 260 stations throughout China. Under Hudson, the China Inland Mission had supplied over half the Protestant missionaries in China. That is phenomenal. So all of that suffering, it's worth it. Not only is the ministry growing, but there's fewer and fewer and fewer of Chinese Buddhists who have to lament the death of a father or a mother or a child without hearing the gospel. 56 of those missionaries died in the Boxers' Rebellion of 1900. And that is a staggering number of martyrs. But listen, the number of missionaries didn't drop. In fact, it quadrupled over the coming decades. That's the kind of impact that God was making through the lives of Hudson and Maria Taylor and so many other missionaries who were involved in the China Inland Mission. So I leave you with these two examples. We'll work through Lottie Moon and Amy Carmichael next, but I just pray you'll take these very brief overviews of these amazing lives and look in the mirror and ask God to really help you reflect on what does it mean for a life to be well lived? What does it mean to truly give yourself to Christ in faithful devotion.